as you know, what I'm obviously going to be talking about with you today is race in science fiction, and in particular, I want to talk about Afrofuturism. So, without any further ado, let's move on. All right, great. As I'm sure you guys know by now, either just from your own sort of travels through science fiction or from this class, there's sort of a history as usual that we tell about race in science fiction. And that story is that science fiction is pretty much the creation of white Europeans and Americans in the late 18th and then in the 19th centuries, and that it's not until the collapse of European colonial projects and the American civil rights movement in the 1960s that we begin to see people of color enter the genre. And, you know, it's a neat and clean story, except that it's not true. One of the things that we're finding now in recent scholarship is that science fiction has been a global phenomenon almost since its inception. We see science fiction coming out of Brazil as early as the 1830s and coming out of China and Japan by the 1860s. Or, yeah, 1860s. So, in short, I think that really what we want to start doing is thinking about how any time a nation or an ethnic group actually begins to participate in industrial culture, they naturally, its authors, turn to science fiction as the premier story form of technoscientific modernity as a way of making sense of its this culture's engagements with these new ways of doing economics and politics and science and technology. More specifically, what we find is authors of all color, and I would certainly include white authors in this, use science fiction to explore the necessary relations of science, society, and race, and to stake claims for themselves and for their communities in the global future imaginary. And as we're going to see, that becomes especially important in the case of Afrofuturism. And so that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today, is this tradition. It's about 150 years old, a tradition of speculative fiction written by Black people that is generally called Afrofuturism, and so that's what I'll be calling it in this talk. All right, so first of all, let me start out by giving you a definition, a working definition of Afrofuturism. Afrofuturism is speculative fiction or science fiction written by both Afro-diasporic and African authors. It's a global aesthetic movement, and it encompasses art, film, literature, music, and scholarship. Mark Derry talks about it. I've got a nice quote up here that hopefully you can see on the PowerPoint as a, quote, process of signification that appropriates images of technology and a prosthetically enhanced future to explore the hopes and fears that people of color face in a high-tech world. Now, there's sort of, as far as I can tell, really two basic goals with Afrofuturism that we want to be thinking about. The first thing that Afrofuturist artists want to do, there's three goals. One is they want to tell good science fiction stories, and I think if you speak with any Black science fiction author from anywhere around the globe, they'll tell you that's sort of first and foremost what they're interested in. But there are two political goals or cultural goals associated with Afrofuturism as well. First is that Afrofuturist artists are interested in recovering lost Black histories and thinking about how those histories inform a whole range of Black cultures today. They also want to think about how these histories and cultures might inspire new visions of tomorrow. All right. So I want to talk a little bit more about this here. A lot of scholars, including non-science fiction scholars, think about Afrofuturism as an extension of the historical recovery projects that Black Atlantic intellectuals have engaged in for well over 200 years now. As Toni Morrison has written about and spoken about eloquently, these kinds of historical recovery projects show how African slaves and their descendants experienced conditions of homelessness, alienation, and dislocation that very much anticipate what Nietzsche described as the founding conditions of modernity. And so you can start to see then why it is that science fiction makes sense, because if you want to think about Black people as being sort of, in some ways, the primary subjects of modernity, those who've sort of had the most intense experiences and engagements with it, science fiction, right, has this grammar that allows us to speak about modernity. Stories about travel through time and space and stories about encounters with the alien other are ideal ways to bring those historical experiences to life for new audiences. And I think if you think a little bit, just to sort of jump myself here for a moment, if you think about Derek Bell's story, how much that story, the lead character, Golightly, is always engaging African-American history to try to confront and make sense of this uncertain future, which he does, and you know, as we all know, doesn't end all that well. All right, the next goal for Afrofuturists is maybe a slightly more positive one, not just to sort of remember the bad past, but to use stories about the past and the present to reclaim the history of the future. And especially what Kojo Aishan talks about. Some of you might know him. He's a British, African-British music critic who's done a lot of really great work on Afrofuturism. And he talks about how histories of the future have been hijacked by what he calls the futures industry. And the futures industry is sort of his term for the place where technoscience, fictional media, and market prediction meet. But what you tend to see in mainstream media again and again and again is the sense that blackness is a catastrophe. Black spaces are zones of absolute dystopia where either capitalism hasn't had a chance to intervene yet or where capitalism has failed. So, and once you start thinking about this, you really do see this again and again in the media. Black cities are always depicted in dystopic ways. Africa itself, right? I mean, it's this gigantic continent with lots of different ecosystems and cultures and nations and people and events and histories, and yet it's always treated somehow as like the place of dystopia, drought, AIDS, famine. You never hear, or you rarely hear as much about positive things, again, unless it's capitalist intervention. What Kojo Aishan sees Afrofuturism as being important for is that that kind of storytelling allows authors, it gives them a public means by which to intervene into those bad futures that are written by the futures industry and to challenge them, change them, write altogether new ones. And he riffs a bit on W.E.B. Du Bois, who some of you might know. He was an African-American sociologist. He actually wrote science fiction as well. And Du Bois talked about double consciousness, that Black people always live under the consciousness of being both African-Americans and just Americans. And Aishan sees what he sees as valuable about Afrofuturism is that it has the ability to enhance double consciousness and create even a triple or quadruple or quintuple consciousness, to give us a sense that there are a lot of different ways to think about being Black, to think about the relations of science, society, and race, and to think about futures that might be in full color rather than whitewashed or black hole despair type futures. All right. So now what I want to do is, now that I've given you a little bit of background on sort of the goals of Afrofuturism, I want to take you through a brief history of Afrofuturism. I can give you some reading recommendations here. And if you want, later on, I would be happy to email you. I actually have a written list of reading recommendations. I'd be happy to send that along to Lars or to post it up to the website. So the first period I want to talk about here is a long one, obviously. And we're going to talk about United States Afrofuturism, which happens from about 1850 to 1960. This period, as you know, obviously marks the establishment of science fiction as well as Afrofuturism. And both were popular genres with a lot of similarities at the beginning. Both science fiction and Afrofuturism were generally written at first by respected mainstream writers who were experimenting with a variety of emergent genres. So for example, you write, of course, the most famous ones would be Mary Shelley, who's playing with the Gothic and with sort of a proto-science fiction in Frankenstein. H.G. Wells, who perfects the future war story with stories like The Battle of Dorking and, of course, War of the Worlds. And then in the United States, Edward Bellamy, who updates the utopia to speak to the industrial age and sort of creates a new form, the techno-utopia, with books like Looking Backwards. We see something very similar happening in United States Afrofuturism at this point in time. So for instance, Charles Chestnut is a mainstream writer who wrote some short stories like The Gooford Grapevine, which was a Gothic commentary on U.S. racism, and it's about Northerners, white Northerners who come to the South and have to deal with sort of the history of racism and of slavery as it sort of is all entwined within a vineyard that the Northerners are buying. Sutney Griggs's Imperium is a future war story where U.S. blacks take up arms against their white oppressors. It's a fascinating story, and it's a particularly interesting story because throughout most of the story, one protagonist who's much more peaceful and looking for an integrated solution to racism, he tries every techno-scientific means necessary, and he tries in particular to educate blacks to become engineers and agricultural experts and to show that they can be modern techno-cultural citizens. And then finally that fails and black people pick up arms, and I said, well, by one means or another, we're going to, make a place for ourselves in this future. And then finally, another story from this period that's really important is Edward A. Johnson's New Light Ahead for the Negro, which was a scientific agricultural utopia predicated on black knowledge and industry. So that's a story where that works, where blacks essentially remake America as a more productive and more racially integrated country, precisely by leveraging the techno-scientific knowledge that they gained as slaves, and then the education they gained as freed men and freed women, and use that to build a better South, and then eventually a better United States. Sorry, I almost lost my computer there. Okay, so that takes us through the roots of Afrofuturism. The genre continues to develop in the early 20th century. And in some ways, it's interesting because it's very much, I don't know if you're familiar with the American racial policy at the turn of the last century. There was a policy in place called separate but equal. And, you know, of course, it was separate, but it wasn't at all equal. And it was a way, right, to sort of keep most resources in the hands of whites and away from blacks. A little bit different on the literary scene. We do find that black and white authors are publishing in different venues. So for instance, you've got white authors are publishing primarily in white-owned and operated magazines like Weird Tales and Amazing Stories and Astounding Science Fiction. Meanwhile, Afrofuturist authors are publishing primarily in black-owned and operated newspapers like The Crisis and the Pittsburgh Courier. What's interesting, though, is that this wasn't a kind of separate but equal policy that was enforced by whites, but instead seems to have been chosen by black authors as far as the historical record reveals at this point in time. And there seem to be a number of reasons for this. One thing that Samuel Delany talks about, and he's done a little work on this, is that a lot of black authors seem to have avoided the genre magazines because they looked really frivolous. And I mean, if you look at the pictures I have up here, you can see how The Crisis, it has a kind of science fictional cover. It has this gigantic woman holding the sun up over a little tiny city. And I mean, that really is a lot like a lot of 1950s sort of campy Hollywood science fiction movies. But there's something about it, right? It's a sort of dynamic art form, is very much part of the modernist art movement. It sort of signals high literature rather than genre literature. And of course, Amazing Stories, you have tiny men fighting gigantic bugs. And so you can see where maybe some authors might have felt, if you're going to try to publish a story about Black revolution, Black technoscientific genius, it may not have been taken particularly seriously in magazines about little tiny white people fighting gigantic bugs. Okay. The other reason that black authors don't seem to have been publishing in the genre magazines at this point in time is simply because there were indeed a number of stories that were relatively racist. Not all of them were by any stretch of the imagination, but more often they were than weren't. And the famous example of this is Stanley G. Weinbaum's Martian Odyssey, a story from, I think, 1932. That, if you haven't read Martian, did you guys read, I don't know if you read Martian Odyssey or not, but oh, you did, great. Okay, so then you might remember, you know, this is a story that's often cited as really important in science fiction history because it's sympathetic to the alien other and tries to find connections between humans and aliens. And up until that time, you didn't see that many stories like that. Of course, the problem with the story, as you might remember, is that the humans who populate Weinbaum's story know that the Martians they encounter are intelligent and rational beings precisely because their knowledge classification systems are more sophisticated than those of African people on Earth. So suddenly, to be human, you have to be not black, essentially. And so again, you can see why people like Du Bois or Chestnut or Griggs might not have wanted to publish in these magazines. It just didn't seem like it was going to be a particularly hospitable place. Too many battles to have to fight. So the main issue here that we see through these stories is, will there be a future for black people? And what is it that black people will have to do to secure a future where they're free citizens? And so as Afrofuturists are publishing, these are the stories they're looking at. And so the goal of the Afrofuturist author then is going to be to tell thrilling stories about black people who use science and technology to do amazing things, survive disasters, start revolutions, and build brave new worlds. So really quickly, let me tell you about three of my favorite stories, and I think three of the most important stories out of this period of US Afrofuturism. The first is Martin Delaney's Blake or the Huts of America. This was published in the Anglo-African magazine. It was a serialized story. And this is a great story. It's an alternate world where African-American slaves revolt against their white Southern masters and establish a free black state in Cuba. Once they're there, what they plan to do is use all the knowledge that they've gained as slaves to build their own cotton empire and undermine the United States South and then the United States sort of grip on the cotton industry and make themselves into technological world players. What I like best about the story isn't actually so much the story itself, which, like many utopias and dystopias, kind of goes on and on and on. But what's interesting about it was that Delaney and his friends actually really were going to do this. All the proceeds from Blake went into a fund that was going to be used to send free blacks back to Liberia, where they were going to partner with African farmers and build a cotton empire, and then undermine the South and do away with slavery by getting an economic stranglehold on the South, essentially. So I like that this is a book that's about something Black people were really going to try to do. So it becomes sort of science fictional at two levels, I think. Another story out of this period that I think is really interesting and important, if you haven't read it before, is W.E.B. Du Bois's The Comet. Like I said, Du Bois is most famously known as a sociologist and one of the first theorists modern theorists of race relations. He actually wrote a couple science fiction stories about this as well, and the one that I really enjoy and that I enjoy teaching is The Comet, which is from a collection of stories that Du Bois published in 1920. And The Comet is a great story. It's a disaster story where a comet that passes through the Earth's atmosphere seems to release a poison gas. And it seems like it kills everyone except one black man who's down in a bank vault at the time. And when he comes up, at first, of course, he's horrified by this situation. But the longer he's by himself on the Earth, the more he kind of starts to like it, because all of a sudden he has access to cars and goods that he couldn't have before. He can go and eat at restaurants he wasn't allowed into before. And so all of a sudden it's seeming like, maybe this disaster wasn't quite so much of a disaster at all. And then eventually he ends up meeting up with a white woman, a photographer and a feminist and the two of them, at first they see each other as aliens, and literally, that's how Du Bois writes about it, as being alien in blood and culture. But they overcome their differences, they work together, they pool their technical know-how, and in the end, they decide they're going to create a new race together. It ends up not working out because, of course, what we learn eventually is that the poison gas didn't kill everyone, the whites come back. And in fact, what's happened is that the black man's child has been killed. So the only person who ends up dead are black babies in this story. So clearly it's a much more pessimistic story than some of the other stories you see in Afrofuturism at this time. And it seems like what Du Bois is saying to us is that the only way that race relations in America will ever be fixed is through a catastrophe that wipes everyone out. So interesting story, kind of fun, has a lot of purple prose. It's fun to read with students. It gets really kind of big and crazy after a while. And then the last story out of this period that's really important is Charles Schuyler's Black International and Black Empire. Schuyler was a journalist for the Pittsburgh Courier, and the story actually ran in the Courier. The Courier is the largest Black-owned and operated newspaper in the world, and that's still true today, actually. And it's cool because they ran the installments from this story side by side with news articles, and there was no distinction made between the news articles and the fiction. And clearly a discerning reader would know the difference, but at the same time it's kind of exciting. You'd be reading your newspaper and you'd be reading about the Great Depression, the war in Europe, etc., and then all of a sudden there's this story about Black Revolution, and it's a really exciting story. This is an alternate world where Afro-diasporic people, and it really is an international group of Black people, come together and they pool their scientific, military, artistic, and business talents to enact a global revolution against the white nations that have enslaved and oppressed them for so long. They do this, and it's kind of a bloodbath. It's exciting. They do this by decimating the United States with biological warfare, bombing Europe into submission. And by the way, the leader of the Air Force is a Black woman, so that's kind of interesting. In 1938, that's early to be sort of thinking in these kind of feminist terms. But she does it, and she does a great job. And then finally, they establish a utopian Black empire in Africa. So it's a book that bounces back and forth between scenes of sort of rampant and gleeful destruction, and then also the sort of building of this utopia in Africa, basically in Liberia, I think. All right, so that gets us through the first period of Afrofuturism. The next period I want to talk about is contemporary United States Afrofuturism, so about 1960 to the present. This is the period I think this is the period people are more familiar with, but I think it's worth going back through it and talking a little bit about it more now that you have some historical context and theoretical context for it. So this is the period essentially when Afrofuturism and mainstream science fiction integrate with one another. We see Black authors in this period publishing in all the same venues as their white counterparts. So in all the major science fiction magazines with all the major publishers. This is the period when major African-American authors like Sam Delaney and Octavia Butler, Jewel Gomez, and Charles Saunders all start publishing as well. By the end of the 20th century, Afrofuturism is very much recognized as a subgenre within science fiction. You have things like, you have anthologies like Sherry R. Thomas's Dark Matter. There's actually two of those, Dark Matter and then Dark Matter Reading the Bones. You have author societies like the Carl Brandon Society, which is it's a society for thinking about race in science fiction. We've got a picture up there of some of the recent recipients of Carl Brandon Society awards. And then we also have, there are conferences in the United States like Black to the Future. There are online sites. I'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. As some of you might know, there are Facebook sites for Black Science Fiction Society. They have their own version of Facebook as well. And then there are things like the World SF blog. So you've really seen this explosion of interest in matters of race, and particularly Afrofuturism. And often it's, of course, Black authors who are taking point on these things and putting them together. What's also interesting, though, about this period is that by the 1990s, you also see white authors, at least in the United States, are beginning to use Afrofuturism as well. And in some ways, of course, this parallels feminism, where when feminist authors first started writing overtly feminist science fiction, a lot of mainstream and male authors were hesitant about that and skeptical that you could really do feminism in science fiction. And then, you know, over the course of 40 years, even I think the biggest holdouts have started using some of the insights of feminism in their science fiction. Again, something similar happening with race. So we have white authors like Paul de Filippo and Kathleen Ann Goonan, who draw from the history of slavery and the civil rights movement, which they participated in as well, to make sense of issues that might emerge in biologically engineered futures. So it becomes, I think what's interesting then is Afrofuturism becomes a way not just to talk about the future of science, society, and race, but also to think about the ways we would create new races or create new kinds of social or cultural divisions with new sciences and technologies. And so it's been really, I think, a fruitful vocabulary for science fiction authors of all different colors. Now, the main issue in contemporary US Afrofuturism is what will the future be like? So at this point, everyone assumes, yes, indeed, there will be a future for Black people. And there might even be a future in full color. But what futures or futures might it be that we'll come up with? And so the goal of the Afrofuturist author at this point is still to tell thrilling stories that grip us, but also to create alternate worlds and new futures by extrapolating from the Afro-diasporic past. So 3 stories here, 2 of which you read, I think that are really key. So first is Octavia Butler's Bloodchild, which was published in Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine in 1984, and then it's been anthologized in a variety of places since then. As you know, this is a future where humans who have left Earth to colonize the stars are enslaved by bug-like aliens who use human men to carry their eggs to term. Slavery has just ended recently for humans, and the 2 races are coming to a point where they're forced to admit their interdependence and are learning to replace ignorance and violence with education and love, right? And I mean, the story, it's a happy ending, right? This is a love story. It ends like a Hollywood movie. The lovers are in each other's arms. There's a baby on the way. You can hear the music swelling practically. It's kind of funny if you think about it that way, or at least positive, a good thing. Other stories are more pessimistic. So for instance, Derek Bell's Space Traders, right, which really warns us that history might repeat itself, and not in a happy way if we don't pay attention and learn from the past. I don't know if you guys had a chance to watch it, but as you know, it was made into a short film for HBO's Cosmic Slop in 1994. You can go watch that on YouTube if you haven't done that already. At this point, right in the story, we know America's in decline and the aliens show up and they promise to solve the country's problems if we hand over all our Black people. It's told from the perspective of a conservative Black presidential advisor who tries to talk the president out of this deal because he does know his history and he understands how history is going to repeat itself. But of course, it doesn't work out. And in the end, what's that last line? It's so great. It's like, and so Black people went into the future the way they came into America in the past. It really makes clear how history is repeating itself. And then finally, a set of novels that if you can get a hold of and read, I really recommend. They're really fun. Stephen Barnes's Lion's Blood and Zulu Heart. These are from the early 2000s. This is an alternate history in which Africa, rather than Europe, becomes the center of techno-scientific development. So for a variety of reasons set in the far, far past, the Greek philosophers, instead of philosophy and art reaching its pinnacle, I guess, in Greece and Rome, everyone moves down to Africa. And so Greek philosophy combines with African military power. And by the 19th century, It's Northern Africans who have colonized the New World. Meanwhile, Europe stays tribal, and so the Africans who go to the New World and who need someone to run their plantations, sure enough, go ahead and use tribal Europeans as slave labor. So what is really interesting to me about this set of novels is how Barnes imagines that history might simply repeat itself, that faced with this certain agricultural and ecological and techno-scientific situation, the conquerors, regardless of who they are going to sort of behave in the same way, and that power will replicate itself regardless of race. The other thing that's sort of interesting about this story is that it doesn't matter who's in control of the United States, the buffalo and the Indians all get killed. So another way in which history ends up repeating itself. All right, so that gets us through the United States Afrofuturism. Now, of course, the thing is, it's not like Afrofuturism has been just part of the United States, just like science fiction is more than the United States. And in fact, what we see is that since the 1960s, Afrofuturism has become an increasingly global phenomenon. This is something that people have talked about less in science fiction studies. So if you do any reading on Afrofuturism, you won't see as much on the global aspects of it. This is something I'm starting to work on, and a few other people are here and there, but it's still pretty new stuff. So this is cool and fun, and you're getting cutting edge scholarship. So enjoy. All right, so what we see with global Afrofuturism is that authors from around the globe, from the Caribbean, from Canada, from Africa, and especially from Ghana, from South Africa, and from Kenya, I think, they're using all the traditional publishing venues. You still see many of these authors publishing in Western science fiction magazines and publishing in regular science fiction imprints. But we're also seeing a real explosion of science fiction online, and especially for African and Afro-diasporic authors. So there's a number of really important Afro-diasporic venues online. The State of Black Science Fiction 2012, that's on Facebook. So if any of you are on there, you can go ahead and join. We'd love to see you there. And then the Black Science Fiction Society, the World Science Fiction Blog. Again, these are all really interesting places where there's a lot of lively interchange between science fiction producers and fans, and really trying to think through the relationship between the West and the rest, as some authors put it, in their fiction, and just in their everyday exchanges with one another. We're also seeing specific online venues coming out of Africa itself. My favorite one right now is Jungle Gym, which is a bi-monthly African pulp magazine, I think based basically in South Africa, but publishing authors all over the continent. Storytime, which is a weekly genre fiction published by African writers, and a place called Threebute, which is an online anthology devoted to questions of African modernity. If you're interested in getting to any of these, again, I'd be happy to send you the URLs, or you can just go start Googling around yourself, and they're very easy to find. So the main issue that we're finding in Afro-diasporic and global Afrofuturism, and especially Afrofuturism coming out of Africa, is again, these questions of what the future will look like. Obviously, these are authors who assume that there will indeed be a future for Black people, but when they're thinking about it, it's not just a matter of thinking about Black versus white futures, but instead thinking about, again, the West versus the rest, which I think is an easy way to think about this. So the goal of the global Afrofuturist author is going to be to create truly strange new futures by combining elements of the West and the rest. All right, and this works out actually differently for Afro-diasporic and African authors. So for instance, Afro-diasporic authors, what you see is doing a much more sort of postmodern, very meta form of science fiction in some ways. So we might think about Caribbean-Canadian author Nalo Hopkinson's Midnight Robber. This is a story where intergalactic and cross-temporal colonization is enabled by a combination of advanced computing networks, nanotechnology, and Caribbean storytelling practices. And it's that combination that becomes key. Hopkinson's heroine survives life in an extraordinarily hostile world and even negotiates a peaceful new future for humans and aliens precisely because she can put white, and I put this like in air quotes, right? So white science and Black storytelling practices together, but she does this in productive new ways, and it allows her to sort of think her way past some of the impasses her father and other people in her world have found themselves at. So this is one thing that is really interesting. Global Afrofuturism tends to be very positive in the long run in ways that we don't necessarily see in US Afrofuturism. And I'm not sure why that is entirely, but there tends to be a real sense that these pasts and presents can be remixed into productive new futures. Another great example of this, and I love this, this is probably my favorite book in the world, is African-Canadian author Minister Faust. Obviously, that's not his real name. But Minister Faust had put out a book in 2004 called Coyote Kings of the Space Age Bachelor Pad. And you should read it if for no other reason than because it has this great title. The story, though, is actually also really fantastic. It's about two African-Canadian geeks who must combine everything they've learned from science fiction and comic books with ancient African scientific and military practices when they discover that one of them is the linchpin in a 7,000-year-old struggle between good and evil. And it's interesting, I taught this book in class last semester, and I was surprised. My students had a really hard time with it at first, and I was shocked because my students are all science fiction fans, and while they're not African-Canadian science fiction fans, I thought that would be sort of easy for them to sort of get on board with the book. But they found it really challenging until they found a way to frame the experience of reading the story. And finally, one day, a group of them came in and they said, I get it. I know what the story's about now. It's Star Wars set 20 years ago in the past in Canada with black people. And if you think about it that way, it becomes again, I think that really gets at the heart of Afrofuturism and sort of remixing of different kinds of culture and messing with issues of time and space. And it's a story set long ago in a galaxy that seems very far away to them. Okay. Finally, of course, I want to talk about Afrofuturism coming out of Africa. And this is not necessarily a new phenomenon. We've seen science fiction coming out of Africa since at least 1960. My guess is it may have been there earlier and we just aren't finding it yet. For a variety of reasons. But there's been a real explosion in the last few years, of course, enhanced by the internet, no doubt. My favorite author, someone to watch for, is a Ghanaian author named Jonathan Dotsi, whose book Virus is coming out in installments. Virus is actually a shorter version, is a short first chapter out of a larger novel he's publishing called Accra 2057. He's publishing in parts of it on his website, parts of it are on Are You Serious's website. I don't know if you guys know him or not, but he's one of the original modern primitives and a real promoter of global technoculture. And then it's also the actual novel will be released from, I want to say Warner Aspect in the next year or two, but I can't remember which publisher exactly. So it will come out from a Western publisher, but it's also coming out as a hyperlinked comic book out of Tribute, which is one of those African websites I had mentioned earlier. And so this is a panel from the Tribute version, the comic book version. So Dotsi's really thinking about this as a multimedia novel and as a novel that really does combine the West and the rest, and that is being published simultaneously in different venues in both Africa and across the globe. So that's cool. The story itself will feel very familiar to you. It's the adventures of a teenage girl from rural Ghana who uses the computer installed in her head to become an illegal information runner in the glamorous but dangerous underworld of Accra 2057. So you should know this story. What's amazing about it is, on the one hand, when you're reading it, you learn tons about Ghanaian history and culture, but it's so easy to absorb it because you know this story. You've read it in Neuromancer, you've seen it in The Matrix. It's a very familiar story. And this is something that African genre writers actually are talking about a lot. The editors of Jungle Gym are very eloquent about this. There's a great online interview with them. And I said one of the things that you really notice is that whereas Afro-diasporic science fiction, so science fiction is being written by descendants of the African diaspora, it tends to be very postmodern, very meta, very intellectually very clever. And you really are thinking all the time about, oh, what is this author doing with Star Wars, with the space opera, whatever. African science fiction, it's pretty straightforward. If someone says I'm writing a cyberpunk story, they're writing a cyberpunk story. And if someone says I'm writing a space opera, it looks like 1930s Stanley G. Weinbaum space opera, except it's always populated by African people with African histories, with African issues, some of which will be familiar to Westerners, some of which won't. But it becomes really easy to absorb the whole totality of it because you understand the narrative form in which it's being presented. And so I think that's really interesting, how we're seeing a sort of return to these very clean, simple story forms in some ways to convey a larger, maybe more complex political message, an aesthetic message as well. Okay, and so this takes us now to my conclusion. All right, great. So now that we've talked a little bit about some of the theoretical and aesthetic underpinnings of Afrofuturism and then talked about its history, its past and present and its future, I hope that what you can see is that science fiction is really functioning. I think the important thing here is to see how science fiction is functioning as a global language that allows people to speak the experience of technoscientific life across centuries, continents, and cultures. As I hope to have shown here today, this is certainly true of the Afro-diasporic and African speculative forms generally called Afrofuturism. There's a tendency in the mainstream media to treat Black people as the victims of a completely dystopic modernity. Afro-diasporic people are often the descendants of slaves upon whose back modern nations were built, and Africans themselves are the victims of colonization practices that have wrought nothing but disease and famine. Of course, as Afrofuturism itself shows, modernity is a lot more complicated than that. In early Afrofuturist stories, slavery produces misery, but it also produces technoscientific brilliance. In later stories, there's actual tales of slavery and colonization. The history of modernity's bad past becomes the source of inspiration for imagining what truly new and at least slightly better futures might look like. And that is what I find so compelling about Afrofuturism. Like all the best science fiction, it gives us hope that there are different ways and better ways to be citizens of the modern global world. Thank you.